Everybody. Hope everybody's doing well wherever they are, and thanks very much for tuning in. Quine famously claims that ontology is about what there is. The ontological question about numbers, say, or properties or possible worlds is just, are there such things? And to be ontologically committed to numbers, properties, possible worlds is just to be committed to saying that, yes, in fact, there are such things, right? It's to be committed to accepting a sentence that quantifies over numbers, properties, possible worlds. Kit Fine, in a recent paper, has argued that this Quinean approach to ontology gets the basic logic and logical form of our ontological theses wrong. To see why, consider the following example. Alice is a realist about natural numbers, right? She accepts what would ordinarily be called realism about the naturals, or natural realism. So she believes in the number 1, the number 2, the number 3, and so on and so forth, right? But she doesn't believe in any negative numbers, we'll say. Beth, by contrast, is a realist about all of the integers. So like Alice, she believes in 1, 2, 3, and so on, but she also believes in the negative numbers. At first glance, it seems like a Quinean will understand the dispute in the following way. Alice is committed just to saying there's at least one natural number, whereas Beth is committed to saying there's at least one integer. Now, the problem with this, or at least one problem, is that realism about the integers ought to be the stronger position here, right? It seems like Beth should hold the stronger view because intuitively, she believes in everything that Alice does and more besides. But this Quinean rendering gets their logical relation exactly backward. Assuming that every natural number is an integer, though not vice versa, the claim that there are natural numbers implies the claim that there are integers, but not vice versa. So the Quinean ends up saying that realism about the naturals is actually the stronger position. And so Vine says the Quinean approach gets the basic logic of ontological commitment wrong. What's missing from the simple Quinean approach, Fine thinks, is a certain kind of generality or universality. When Alice says that she's a realist about the natural numbers, she doesn't just mean there's at least one of them. Somehow she's committing herself to all of the natural numbers, and likewise for Beth, right? These commitments aren't merely existential, they're somehow general or universal, right? They're commitments to all of the naturals, all of the integers. Now, it seems clear to me that a Quinean is going to have trouble accommodating this. The obvious way for a Quinean to go is to say, okay, when Alice says she's a realist about the naturals, what she's saying is that all of the natural numbers exist, where for Quine, to exist is just to be the value of a bound variable, right? And likewise for Beth and her integer realism. Now, one obvious problem with this approach is that what we have on the slide is two completely trivial statements. It's trivially true that every natural number exists. It's trivially true that every integer exists, given that existence is just being the value of a bound variable. But there's a deeper and I think more revealing problem here, which is that these renderings just aren't going to capture the intuitive content of natural realism and integer realism. And it's not going to capture our sense of their logical relationships to each other. So compare Alice and Beth to Kathy and Dana. Kathy is a kind of strange realist about the naturals. She believes in the number 1, but she doesn't believe in 2, 3, and so on. Likewise, Dana is a realist about the integers, but only about some of them, right? She believes in the number 2, but not in the number 1, the number 3, and she believes in -1, but not -2, not -3. The problem here, going back to the previous slide, is that Kathy and Dana can accept these two statements respectively. Kathy can say, yeah, it's true, every natural number exists. But Kathy only believes in one natural number. She just believes in the number 1, right? So intuitively, she does not count as a natural realist in the way that Alice does. And likewise for Beth. Now, what's important here is that we want to say that integer realism is stronger than natural realism because to be an integer realist is to believe in everything that the natural realist believes in and more besides. But we clearly haven't captured that element of the view because, as I've described Kathy and Dana's views, there's actually no overlap in the numbers they believe in at all, right? So switching from existential to universal quantification hasn't actually helped us capture what was missing from the original statements. And I think that this is a more revealing problem because it actually applies to Fine's own approach. So Fine rejects the Quinean picture of ontology. It says ontology is not just about what there is, it's about what's real, where what's real is supposed to be a subset of what there is. And given this distinction between what there is and what's real, Fine says that natural realism and integer realism are to be understood as they are on this slide. The claim that all natural numbers are real and all integers are real, respectively. But it's clear that Kathy and Dana could also accept these two formulations, right? Kathy might very well say, yes, I agree there's a distinction between what there is and what's real, and I agree that every natural number has this special property of being real. But that's because I think there's only one natural number, number 1, and that one number has the property of being real, right? Kathy could very well accept a position like this. So she could accept this formulation of natural realism. But it seems clear she's not a realist about the natural numbers in the way that Alice is supposed to be, right? So again, merely shifting from existential quantification to universal quantification, even if we add this extra talk about what's real, doesn't actually help capture what was missing from the simple Quinean approach. So I want to suggest an alternative diagnosis of the problem here. I think Fine is right that these views can't be just easily understood as simple existential quantifications, but I want to say what's missing is not a kind of generality or universality. Right? To engage in this kind of general or universal commitment, to say, I believe in all of the naturals, or I believe in all of the integers, or more generally, to say, I believe in all of the Fs, is just to commit yourself to whichever Fs there happen to be, right? It's not to take a specific explicit position on which Fs there are, right? But it seems like to be a realist about the natural numbers, say, is not just to say, I believe in whichever natural numbers there happen to be, right? That's something that Kathy can say perfectly well. Rather, it's to take a particular stance on which natural numbers there are. And more particularly, it's the stance we would expect somebody to take, which is that it's not just the number 1 that exists, it's number 1, number 2, number 3, and so on and so forth. So I want to say that what was missing from the simple Quinean approach was not generality or universality, but rather particularity. With this in mind, I think we can get a much better rendering of both natural realism and integer realism. In order to take a stance on which natural numbers there are, Alice is going to need some way of specifying which natural numbers there are in advance. Right? She has to have a way of picking out what she's talking about when she talks about the natural numbers and affirms that those things exist. And one way she might do this is through something like the axioms of piano arithmetic. So, well, look, the number 1 is a natural number, and I believe that that thing exists. I also believe that every natural number has a successor, and that every successor of a natural number is itself a natural number. If she puts all this together, she can get a more specific statement of what she's committing herself to when she commits herself to the natural numbers. And we can make a similar move for the negative integers, right? Now, what we have here is a way of specifying in advance what is going to count as a natural number, what's going to count as a negative integer, and a way of sort of committing yourself all at once to these particular things. So now we can say the following. What we have on the left is a statement of realism about the natural numbers. This is a statement that captures that particularity that was missing from the original Quinean statement. And realism about the integers is just going to be the conjunction of realism about the naturals and realism about the negative integers, right? So now we've got that particularity that was missing, but we've also captured the comparative strengths of these two views, because it turns out that to be a realist about the integers is to believe in all of the natural numbers and more besides. Right? Now, Fine actually considers a view of this sort, and he has a couple of objections to it. I'm only going to deal with one here in this presentation. And the objection is that this approach to understanding natural realism and integer realism doesn't generalize to all realist positions. And so it's actually going to prevent us from being certain kinds of realists. So one of his examples is realism about sets. Right? Suppose you want to say you're a realist about sets. The question will arise, well, which sets do you believe in? You can get some of the way to an answer to that question. You can use the von Neumann sequence or the Zermelo sequence to just construct a list of here are a bunch of sets that I believe in. But now, do you also believe in all of the singleton sets that there are? If you want to say yes, the only way you can specify which singletons there are is by specifying which objects there are. And unless you're a Spinozist who thinks that the only object there is the universe, then you're not in a position to do this, right? But I think that the correct response to this is just to say, well, the word realism is a philosopher's technical term, and it gets used in slightly different ways in different contexts. In some ontological debates, realism is a particularized ontological commitment of the sort I've tried to describe in the case of natural realism and integer realism. Right? If someone says they're a realist about the natural numbers, you expect them to say something like what's on the left here, right? You think they have a specific position on which natural numbers there are, and you've got a pretty good idea of what that position is going to be. It's going to be something like this. But in other debates, it seems like realism just picks out an existential commitment, right? Something that fits the original Quinean idea. It's just to say there are such things, right? You can be a realist about sets while having wildly different views about which particular sets there are, right? A theist and an atheist will disagree about the existence of the singleton set of God, but they're both realists about sets, right? So what we need to recognize, I think, is a distinction between two kinds of ontological commitments. Merely existential commitments that don't involve this more specific position, and particularized commitments that do. And what Fine's objection rests on is this assumption that all realisms are going to be alike. And I just don't think that assumption holds. Okay, so thanks very much for listening. I've tried to keep this relatively short. So here's a quick list of some selected sources. I didn't talk about all of this material here, but if anyone wants to get in touch with me, there is a longer version of this paper where I deal with some of these things in more detail. But for now, thanks very much.